When the very first Fate collab with HSR was announced, I was convinced we were getting Saber, Rin, Archer, and Gilgamesh as playable characters. What I didn't expect though was for both Rin and the King of Heroes Gilgamesh to not even be announced in the first year or so. And now that I think about it, Star Rail couldn't have released Gilgamesh and Amphorius, because then Archer wouldn't be the only faker. My glorious King of Heroes is finally in Star Rail, and I couldn't be happier. I can't wait to see how he interacts with the other Star Rail characters, but one thing's for sure, we need to hide Clara. If you want to learn everything there is to know about Gilgamesh, this is the video for you, because in it, I'm going to be going over Gilgamesh's kit, how to play him, his best teams, and what to invest in. So with all of that being said, my name is Braxophone, but you can call me Gilgabrax, and let's talk about the King of Heroes. I don't think I've ever felt like a character has been more lore accurate than Gilgamesh before. First off, I'm pretty sure he's the only character with a portrait that shines and sparkles like this. Genuinely, what a diva. But more importantly, this guy is literally uninterested in fighting unworthy enemies. He thinks so lowly of all of his enemies and the allies on his team that he will do nothing except basic attack until something catches his interest. I'm not joking, he won't even let you take his turn. He just basic attacks anytime he comes up until he's interested. That's my goat right there. Basically, Gilgamesh has a stacking buff called Interest, and until he gets 10 of it, he'll automatically basic attack every time his turn comes up. He's like Regigigas, except there's no partner Pokemon with neutralizing gas. The good news is that every single action your allies take will give him interest, including things like follow-up attacks and ultimates. In fact, due to one of his passives, he gains an extra 2 interest for every ally ultimate activated, so he gains 1 per ally action, unless it's an ultimate, in which case he gains a total of 3 interest. Likewise, I am gaining about 5% interest on the loan that I took out to E6 In that same passive, he also gets 30% of the energy used to cast that ally ultimate, so characters like Saber, who have 360 energy requirements, give him 108 energy whenever she ults. Gilgamesh's technique also grants him 3 interest upon entering battle, and once he earns 10 stacks of interest, his interest stays peaked for the rest of the battle, so you don't have to consistently keep reaching 10. This is important because his interest being peaked unlocks his skill, which when he uses it, will fire off treasures from his armory, exploding for a Gilgillion damage. If I had even a fraction of the accumulated wealth that he has in his armory, I might be able to order DoorDash 3 times. Interest will give Gilgamesh 10% speed per stack, which adds up quick because by the time it's his turn, it's like, I'm fast as fuck, boy! His talent also gives him 40% ult damage bonus for 3 turns when an ally uses their ultimate, so that's pretty big. On top of that, with one of his passives, he gains 25% crit damage per interest he has gained throughout the battle up to 6 stacks. So he basically just has a free 150% crit damage, it feels like all the time. But when he uses his skill, it resets his interest, and even though he'll keep the crit damage buff, his speed bonus goes back to 0 until more interest is gained. His skill also gives him a buff that allows him to ignore 30% of enemy defenses for 3 turns though, which is pretty nuts. While he does have armored shoulder pads, he also has both of his tits out, which means that all allies are going to get a 20% attack and crit damage buff, and if an ally has over 140 max energy to cast their ult, they also get 1% more attack and crit, up to 100% in excess. So in total, he grants up to 30% fixed energy gain based on ally ult max energy, 150% crit damage, 40% ult damage bonus, a lot of speed, and 30% defense ignore, all to himself, and up to 120% attack and crit damage to allies who have at least 240 max energy, but a minimum of 20% attack and crit damage to all allies. Either way, it's a pretty solid buff for just existing, and especially for not being a support at all. Lastly, his ultimate costs a whopping 360 energy and is pretty much lore accurate. Enuma Elish has a crazy 1400% multiplier, and it absolutely nukes. This thing's got more animation budget than the entire Demon Slayer movie. In fact, it does so much damage that sometimes it's not worth using, especially if you can hold it for an extra turn or two to guarantee that you can fire it off at the start of the next cycle. If enemies are low enough HP to be overkilled by a ton of excess damage, you might as well save it, even if it looks really cool. Speaking of cool, for some reason Star Rail decided to make Gilgamesh and Saber have a joint follow-up attack. And while I don't think I really understand the initial thought process, because Saber pretty much despises the guy, the animation is really funny. Somehow, even when Gilgamesh is simping, he gains 1000 aura. The joint follow-up attack does absurd damage based on Gilgamesh's and Saber's attack, which in my my opinion, is also pretty cool. It activates after his tally above his portrait reaches 8, and it increases by 1 for every single attack done by Gilgamesh or Saber. It also grants Gilgamesh 3 interest and Saber 120 fixed energy. But more importantly than that, it literally doubles the damage of Saber's next ultimate. So Saber mains, if you don't mind playing with Gilgamesh, I think it's worth it. I will say though, it is a little odd having Gilgamesh rely on Saber of all people for his damage, because with enemies he usually just Gilgamogs them. But either way, though Gilgamesh's kit can appear restrictive, he's actually got quite a few viable teams. On top of that, he's not like your conventional characters that follow a strict rotation, since his speed is always changing. So he's a lot more fun and freestyle to play in my opinion, especially when you consider how fast he's able to get his ultimate. But with that said, he still needs to be built. So for his talent priority, I'd level his ultimate, then talent, then skill, and lastly basic attack if you're even gonna level it at all. But next up, let's go over how to build him. So I know what you're thinking. What holy relics, what ornate pieces, what worldly treasures could we possibly give the King of Heroes that he does not already have? Well, luckily for you, not even the King of Heroes can roll crit rate. Gilgamesh doesn't have a dedicated relic set, but he can use the same ones you've already farmed for a billion times. I personally recommend Scholar Lost in Erudition because it increases his ultimate and skill damage significantly, which is the majority of his damage. It also gives crit rate on the 2-piece combo. But if you have a better Genius of Brilliant Stars set, that one also works too, and in some scenarios can even outperform the Scholar set. Specifically, playing Gilgamesh with Mordenak's Blade and taking into account Gilgamesh's built-in defense ignore, 4-piece Genius of Brilliant Stars will stack up even more defense ignore, even against enemies who are not quantum weak. So in theory, this set is better than Scholar, but it's usually less than like a 1% difference against non-quantum weak enemies. So ultimately, if Mordenak's Blade is on the team, you should just choose whatever set you have better substats on. As for planar sets, his best in-slot option is Cosmic Life Sciences Institute, which will grant him 32% damage bonus for basically doing nothing, which for a planar set is pretty absurd. Alternatively, you can also use Izumo on him if played with Saber, since that's one you might have already farmed, and it's got very similar performance. For main stats, due to his absurd crit damage gain, I highly recommend running a crit rate body, and for the rest, attack percent boots, damage bonus sphere, and an attack rope. Overall, attack percent boots are going to be better for him because he gains so much speed already, and most of his energy gain is fixed, so an ER rope doesn't affect most of it. For substats, aim to get him to 100% crit rate, and then the rest can all just be crit damage and attack. Effect res is also never bad. Honestly, you could give him the best relics in the entire universe, and who knows, he still might not put a shirt on. Since there's nothing covering his beautiful chest, here's a summary of his entire build, for those of you who are too busy observing our king in all of his glory. His light cone situation is a bit odd though, we'll go over those next. So after doing a ton of research, I've pretty much come to the conclusion that I have 1 on the Fall of an Aeon, and I need 4 of them. I don't understand why this guy even needs a light cone, quite frankly. They should have just given him a passive that lets him take any light cone from his arbory or your friends list or something. Either way, his signature, surprisingly, isn't actually that good in the simulations we've been running. It's still his best in slot, but for his personal damage, it's kind of just alright. It gives him 18% attack and 10% energy regen, which we already kind of established in the build section isn't actually that crazy, but in addition to that, he gets 72% ult damage dealt, and all allies gain 24% crit damage. I really don't know what they were cooking here because it's only pulling ahead of the free-to-play Herta Shop light cone by like 6%, but on the bright side, that means you have an awesome free-to-play light cone option. The only other destruction cone worth considering for him is Saber's light cone, a thankless coronation, but realistically, unless you have an extra one lying around, it's gonna be more useful on Saber than him. If On the Fall of an Aeon isn't available for him, the Battle Pass Trail of Bygone Blood is pretty solid for him, and a Secret Vow is another solid 4-star option. I highly recommend Aeon though if you can, because this is his light cone chart. You could probably see the dilemma. Once you've got his light cone figured out though, I recommend checking out the team section because there's some real bangers in there. I'm gonna get into his teams in a second, but I just, look at this. Look. If I was not this zoomed in, I would think these are the exact same thing, dude. Low-key though, Gilgamesh's eyes make Archer look like he's Sid the Sloth a little bit. Okay, so Gilgamesh teams, right? This is a guy that you can play him as a sole DPS, it's not gonna be the best, but you can play him with Saber and he's going to excel. And this is the good stuff, okay? So Mordenak's Blade is a character that is able to shred enemy defense and apply a massive vulnerability. And because you are playing a dual DPS team with Saber and Gilgamesh, both of these characters are gonna benefit from it pretty dang massively. Now, we've already talked about the Saber and Gilgamesh synergy over in the kit section of the video, so I'm going to be referencing a few things there, namely the joint attack that's going to be granting Saber a significant chunk of her energy back. Gilgamesh also gets a ton of energy based off of other characters using their ultimates, so your goal is going to be to basically spam ult as much as possible, which is why I have Huohuo in this team. But that doesn't mean Huohuo is the only sustain you can play. It just means that she lends herself very well to this team because she grants 20% of your max energy back, and these two characters both have 360 max energy. So for reference, Huohuo is giving them almost 2.5 turns worth of skill energy alone. Now, granted, both Saber and Gilgamesh do have mechanics to get their energy much faster than that, so it's not like they're just sitting there hitting skill and that's it. But Huohuo giving energy is going to be massively helpful, and also Mordenak's blade for uptime purposes. You do want him to be able to ult frequently as well. So this is going to be his best in slot team at E0, and if you have access to it, I highly recommend it. Now, if you want to play Gilgamesh as a sole carry unit without Saber, he can definitely clear MOC, but it may struggle with things like Anomaly Arbitration. Either way, you can technically play him without Saber and run Sunday or Tribi, and this is namely for people that don't have Saber, because if you were playing Saber on a separate team, then obviously you would need Sunday for her, so that would cause problems. But both of these characters can lend themselves pretty well to Gilgamesh dishing out some solid damage, and Sunday especially is very helpful just because you are able to give him a lot of extra energy. Remember, Gilgamesh gets 30% fixed energy based off of what the character spent, so not only is Sunday going to be giving him a chunk of energy from his ultimate, but he's also going to be taking 30% of Sunday's ult cost as well. Now, this is pretty cope compared to Sunday, but you do also have Tingyun as an option, and honestly, if you don't have access to Mordenak's blade, you can play Tingyun and Sunday for a full energy funneling team with Gilgamesh. The reason Mordenak's blade is so important, though, is because Mordenak's blade is already going to shred enemy defense by 30%, and Gilgamesh's skill is going to allow him to ignore an additional 30% of enemy defense. So with these two alone, you do get 30% defense shred and 30% defense ignore, plus vulnerability, which is absolutely crazy. And that really helps with his overall damage. So losing blade here will definitely take a hit. Now, this team with Mordenak's blade, Ashvale, and Gilgamesh is absolutely crazy because Ashvale is able to reduce enemy defense by 40%, Mordenak's blade gets to do another 30%, and then Gilgamesh gets to ignore 30% defense. So basically, these three characters together do work really well to dish out a ridiculous amount of damage, and Gilgamesh Ashvale as a combo is very powerful. It's not as strong as Gilgamesh Saber. However, if you don't have Saber and you do want to play as Gilgamesh, this team is a viable option for you. Now, one other thing to keep in mind with team building is that you are probably going to be using Lushaka on some of your supports, and that's going to buff the leftmost character in your team. Between Saber and Gilgamesh, which character to actually buff? I've seen a bunch of calculations for buffing Saber or Gilgamesh, and all of them are pretty much like within 0.5% of each other. So for myself, I usually end up buffing Saber, and also I always put like the main character I'm talking about in this slot in the team because they're the closest to the screen, and I think it's like yes, Piccolo, we see the fit. But anyways, I buff Saber with it. You can technically buff Gilgamesh, and it still works out just fine. But overall, these are kind of his teams for now, and hopefully Saber doesn't ever fall out of relevancy, because if Saber falls out of relevancy, there's a high likelihood that Gilgamesh also falls out of relevancy. But considering that the Fate collab is going to last like probably, I don't know, another year, maybe we'll get some more characters or something. Maybe they're not fully cooked, but either way, for now, this is pretty good. So I like the Saber Gilgamesh team, and the Asheville Gilgamesh team is also really good, but technically you can play him as a sole DPS. It just ends up not being as good as the other options we already talked about. So with all that being said, even though he is a free unit, he is not as good as Archer, but he is still viable. And because he's free, I mean, you can just decide if you want to get Archer or if you want to get this guy. I think this guy's pretty cool though. I like Gilgamesh. Speaking of pretty cool, let's talk about his Eidolons, because if you really enjoy playing him as a sole DPS, then you're probably going to want to invest in those. If you've made it this far in the video, you must be one of Gilgamesh's most loyal subjects, which means you're pulling E6 and you don't even need me to tell you what to do. But regardless, I kinda need to point out E1 to you guys, because E0 Gilgamesh is fine, but E1 is crazy. So first off, E1 makes it so that his 30% defense ignore applies to your whole team now, but it also gives him a big 60% attack buff. And on top of that, when he skills, he gets an additional 40 fixed energy. So that is over doubling the energy he gets per skill, which is ridiculous. So E1 is a team-wide buff and 2 personal buffs. This Eidolon alone makes him a significantly better character, and it really begs the question, who was in the kitchen for the light code? For E2, Gilgamesh instantly gets 5 interest when entering combat, which puts him at 8 with his technique. His ult also gives him 5 interest off the bat, so 50% speed immediately after each ult, making him way faster. E2 also increases his skill multiplier by a pretty significant amount. Now, E3 is a skill and basic attack level up, and E4 is an energy regen increase of 20%, though it still doesn't really feel that impactful due to so much of his kit recovering fixed energy. E5 is an ult and talent level up, and lastly, E6 gives him 80% more power multiplier on every Enuma Elish bounce, which after E5 bumps his multiplier from 1400% to 2340%, which is insanely high. And he'll be ulting more due to his speed increases from E2 and the extra energy from E1. He also gets up to 3 stored up stacks to apply to his ult for every ally ult used, and each one of these points consumed is going to give him 100% more crit damage on his ult. His entire team also is going to get 20% res pen, so overall, E6 is cooking. Now, the main thing to think about with his Eidolons is whether or not getting E1 or his light cone is going to be more worth it, and it's kind of a no-brainer in my opinion. E1 on Gilgamesh is infinitely more impactful than his light cone, and with E1, you can run Gilgamesh without Saber or any other dual DPS characters against most endgame content and come out on top pretty easily. His hyper carry potential at E1 is significantly higher, so E1 over S1 for sure, but after E1, his E2 and S1 are pretty similar value. So if you want to see what I'm referencing, it's this chart that shows Eidolon gains for Gilgamesh. And if you're not at all a Fate watcher, but you made it to this part in the video, first of all, thanks for watching, and second of all, if you want to see some aura combat slop of Gilgamesh, go ahead and watch the pilot episode of Fate Strange Fake. It's incredible, and you can thank me later, mongrels.